Section 6 of T. de Witt Talmage as I Knew Him. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by K. Hand. T. de Witt Talmage as I Knew Him by Thomas de Witt Talmage. Milestone 4, Part 2. I began my work of enlarging and improving the Brooklyn church almost the week following my installation. My first vacation, a month, began on June 25, 1869, the trustees of the church having signified and ordered repairs, alterations, and improvements at a meeting held that day, and further suspending Sabbath services for 4 weeks. I spent part of my vacation at East Hampton, Long Island, going from there for 2 or 3 short lecturing trips. I find that I can never rest over 2 weeks. More than that wearies me. Of all the places I have ever known, East Hampton is the best place for quiet and recuperation. I became acquainted with it through my brother-in-law, Rev. S. L. Mershon. His first pastorate was at the Presbyterian Church in East Hampton, where, as a young man, I preached some of my first sermons. East Hampton is always home to me. When a boy in grammar school and college, I used to visit my brother-in-law and his wife, my sister Mary. Later in life I established a summer home there myself. I particularly recall one incident of this month's vacation that has affected my whole life. One day while resting at Sharon Springs, New York, walking in the park of that place, I found myself asking the question, I wonder if there is any special mission for me to execute in this world. If there is, may God show it to me. There soon came upon me a great desire to preach the gospel through the secular printing press. I realized that the vast majority of people, even in Christian lands, never enter a church, and that it would be an opportunity of usefulness infinite if that door of publication were opened. And so I recorded that prayer in a blank book, and offered the prayer day in and day out until the answer came, though in a way different from that which I had expected, for it came through the misrepresentation and persecution of enemies. And I have to record it for the encouragement of all ministers of the gospel who are misrepresented, that if the misrepresentation be virulent enough, and bitter enough, and continuous enough, there is nothing that so widens one's field of usefulness as hostile attack, if you are really doing the Lord's work. The bigger the lie told about me, the bigger the demand to see and hear what I was really doing. From one stage of sermonic publication to another the work has gone on, until week by week, and for about 23 years, I have had the world for my audience as no man ever had. The syndicates inform me that my sermons go now to about 25 millions of people in all lands. I mention this not in vain boast, but as a testimony to the fact that God answers prayers. Would God I had better occupied the field and been more consecrated to the work. The following summer, or rather early spring, I requested an extension of my vacation time in order to carry out a plan to visit the Old World. As the trustees of the church considered that the trip might be of value to the church as well as to myself, I was given leave of absence from pastoral duties for 3 months' duty from June 18, 1870. All that I could do had been done in the plans and constructing the new tabernacle. I could do nothing by staying home. I have crossed the Atlantic so often that the recollections of this first trip to Europe are, at this writing, merely general. I think the most terrific impression I received was my first sight of the ocean the morning after we sailed. The most instructive were the ruins of church and abbey and palaces. I walked up and down the stairs of Holyrood Palace, once upon a time considered one of the wonders of the world, and I marvelled that so little was left of such a wonderful place. Ruins should be rebuilt. The most spiritual impression I received was from the music of church organs in the Old World. I stopped one nightfall at Freiburg, Switzerland, to hear the organ of world-wide celebrity in that place. I went into the cathedral at nightfall. All the accessories were favourable. There was only one light in all the cathedral, and that a faint taper on the altar. I looked up into the venerable arches and saw the shadows of centuries. And when the organ awoke, the cathedral awoke, and all the arches seemed to lift and quiver as the music came under them. That instrument did not seem to be made out of wood and metal, but out of human hearts, so wonderfully did it pulsate with every emotion, now laughing like a child, now sobbing like a tempest. At one time that night it seemed as if a squadron of saddened spirits going up from the earth had met a squadron of descending angels whose glory beat back the woe. In Edinburgh I met Dr. John Brown, author of the celebrated Rab and His Friends. That one treatise gave him immortality and fame, and yet he was taken at his own request to the insane asylum and died insane. "What are you writing now, Dr. Brown?" I said to him in his study in Edinburgh. "Oh, nothing," he replied. "I never could write. I shall never try again." I saw in his face and heard in his voice that melancholy that so often unhorsed him. I went to Paris for the first time in this summer of 1870. It was during the Franco-German War. I stood studying the exquisite sculpturing of the gate of the Tuileries. Lost in admiration of the wonderful art of that gate, I knew not that I was exciting suspicion. Lowering my eyes to the crowds of people, I found myself being closely inspected by government officials, who from my complexion judged me to be a German, and that for some belligerent purpose I might be examining the gates of the palace. My explanations in very poor French did not satisfy them, and they followed me long distances until I reached my hotel, and were not satisfied until from my landlord they found that I was only an inoffensive American. Inoffensive Americans were quite as welcome in Europe in 1870 as they are now. I was not curious of the signs I found anywhere about me of aristocratic grandeur, of the deference paid to lineage and ancient family name. I know in America some people look back on the family line, and they are proud to see that they are descended from the Puritans or the Huguenots, and they rejoice in that as though their ancestors had accomplished a great thing to repudiate Catholic aristocracy. I look back on my family line, and I see there such a mingling and mixture of the blood of all nationalities that I feel akin to all the world. I returned from my first visit to Europe more thankful than ever for the mercy of having been born in America. The trip did me immeasurable good. It strengthened my faith in the breadth and simplicity of a broad-minded religion. We must take care how we extend our invitation to the church, that it be understandable to everyone. People don't want the scientific study of religion. On Sunday morning, September 25th, 1870, the new tabernacle erected on Schemerhorn Street was dedicated to the worship of Almighty God. It was to my mind a common-sense church, as I had planned it to be. In many of our churches we want more light, more room, more ventilation, more comfort. Vast sums of money are expended on ecclesiastical structures, and men sit down in them, and you ask a man how he likes the church, he says, "I like it very well, but I can't hear." The voice of the preacher dashes against the pillars. Men sit down under the shadows of the Gothic arches and shiver, and feel they must be getting religion or something else, they feel so uncomfortable. We want more common sense in the rearing of churches. There is no excuse for lack of light when the heavens are full of it, no excuse for lack of fresh air when the world swims in it. It ought to be an expression, not only of our spiritual happiness, but of our physical comfort when we say, "How amiable are thy tabernacles, O Lord God of hosts! A day in thy courts is better than 1,000." My dedication sermon was from Luke 14:23. "And the Lord said unto the servants, Go out into the highways and hedges, and compel them to come in, that my house may be filled." The Rev. T.G. Butter, D.D., offered the dedicatory prayer. Other clergymen, whose names I do not recall, were present and assisted at the services. The congregation in attendance was very large, and at the close of the services a subscription and collection were taken up amounting to $13,000 towards defraying the expenses and the cost of the church. In less than a year the congregation had grown so large and the attendance of strangers so pressing that the new church was enlarged again, and on September 10th, 1871, the tabernacle was rededicated with impressive services. The sermon was preached by my friend, the Rev. Stephen H. Ting, D.D. He was a great worker, and suffered, as many of us in the pulpit do, from insomnia. He was the consecrated champion of everything good, a constant sufferer from the lash of active work. He often told me that the only encouragement he had to think he would sleep at night was the fact that he had not slept the night before. Insomnia may be only a big word for those who did not understand its effect. It has stimulated intellectuality and exhausted it. One of the greatest English clergymen had a gas jet on each side of his bed, so that he may read at night when he could not sleep. Horace Greeley told me he had not had a sound sleep in 15 years. Charles Dickens understood London by night better than any other writer, because, not being able to sleep, he spent that time in exploring the city. I preached at the evening service from the text in Luke 16:5. How much owest thou unto my Lord? It was a wonderful day for us all. Enough money was taken in by collections and subscriptions at the morning and evening services to pay the floating debt of the church. We received that one day $21,000. I quote the following resolution made at a meeting in my study the next Thursday evening of the session, from the records of the Tabernacle. In regard to the payment of the floating debt of this church and congregation, the session adopted the following resolution, viz. In view of the manifest instance that God has heard the supplications of this people regarding the floating debt of the church, and so directed their hearts as to accomplish the object, it is therefore resolved that we set apart next Wednesday evening as a special season of religious thanksgiving to God for his great goodness to us as a church in granting unto us this deliverance. I reverently and solemnly believe the new tabernacle was built by prayer. My congregation with great munificence provided for all my wants, and so I can speak without any embarrassment on the subject while I denounce the niggardliness of many of the churches of Jesus Christ, keeping some men, who are very apostles for piety and consecration, in circumstances where they are always apologetic, and have not that courage which they would have, could they stand in the presence of people whom they know were faithful to the discharge of their financial duties to the Christian Church. Alas, for those men of whom the world is not worthy! In the United States today the salary of ministers averages less than $600, and when you consider that some of the salaries are very large, see to what straits many of God's noblest servants are this day reduced. A live church will look after all its financial interests, and be as prompt in the meeting of those obligations as any bank in any city. My church in Brooklyn prospered because it was a soul-saving church. It has always been the ambition of my own church that it should be a soul-saving church. Pardon for all sin, comfort for all trouble, eternal life for all the dead. Moral conditions in the cities of New York and Brooklyn were deplorably bad during the first few years I went there to preach. There was an onslaught of bad literature and stage immorality. For instance, there was a lady who came forth as an authoress under the assumed name of George Sand. She smoked cigars. She dressed like a man. She wrote in style ardent and eloquent, mighty in its gloom, terrible in its unchastity, vivid in its portraiture, damnable in its influence, putting forth an evil which has never relaxed, but has hundreds of copyists. Yet so much worse were many French books that came to America than anything George Sand ever wrote, that if she were alive now she might be thought almost a reformer. What an importation of unclean theatrical stuff was brought to our shores at that time! And yet professors of religion patronized such things. I remember particularly the arrival of a foreign actress of base morals. She came intending to make a tour of the States, but the remaining decency of our cities rose up and cancelled her contracts, and drove her back from the American stage, a woman fit for neither continent. I hope I was instrumental to some degree in her banishment. We were crude in our morals then. I hope we are not merely civilized in them today. I hope we understand how to live better than we did then. Scarcely a year after the final dedication of our tabernacle in 1871 it was completely burned, just before a morning Sabbath service in December, 1872. I remember that Sabbath morning. I was coming to the church when I saw the smoke against the sky. I was living in an outlying section of the city. I had been absent for 3 weeks, and as I saw that smoke I said to my wife, "I should not wonder if that is the tabernacle." At the same time this was said in a pleasantry and not in earnest. As we came on nearer where the church stood I said quite seriously, "I shouldn't wonder if it is the tabernacle." When I came within a few blocks, and I saw a good many people in distress running across the street, I said, "It is the tabernacle." And when we stood together in front of the burning house of God it was an awfully sad time. We had stood together through all the crises of suffering, and we must needs build a church in the very hardest of times. To put up a structure in those days, and so large a structure and so firm a structure as we needed, was a very great demand upon our energies. The fact that we had to make that struggle in the worst financial period was doubly hard. It was a merciful providence that none of the congregation was in the church at the time. It was an appalling situation. In spite of the best efforts of the fire department the building was in ruin in a few hours. My congregation was in despair, but in the face of trial God has always given me all but superhuman strength. In 1,000 ways I had been blessed. The gospel I had preached could not stop then, I knew, and while my people were completely discouraged I immediately planned for a newer, larger, more complete tabernacle. We needed more room for the increasing attendance, and I realized that opportunity again was mine. We continued our services in the Academy of Music in Brooklyn while the new tabernacle was being built. Not for a minute did I relax my energies to keep up the work of a practical religion. There were 300,000 people in Brooklyn who had never heard the gospel preached, an army worthy of Christian interest. There was room for these 300,000 people in the churches of the city. There was plenty of room in heaven for them. An ingenious statistician, taking the statement made in Revelation 21, that the heavenly Jerusalem was measured and found to be 12,000 furlongs, and that the length and height and breadth of it are equal, says that would make heaven in size 948 sextillion, 988 quintillion cubic feet. And then reserving a certain portion for the court of heaven and the streets, and estimating that the world may last 100,000 years, he ciphers out that there are over 5 trillion rooms, each room 17 feet long, 16 feet wide, 15 feet high. But I have no faith in the accuracy of that calculation. He makes the rooms too small. From all I can read, the rooms will be palatial, and those who have not had enough room in this world will have plenty of room at the last. The fact is that most people in this world are crowded, and though out on a vast prairie or in a mountain district people may have more room than they want, in most cases it is house built close to house, and the streets are crowded, and the cradle is crowded by other cradles, and the graves crowded in the cemetery by other graves, and one of the richest luxuries of many people in getting out of this world will be the gaining of unhindered and uncramped room. And I should not wonder if, instead of the room that the statistician ciphered out as only 17 feet by 16, it should be larger than any of the rooms at Berlin, St. James, or Winter Palace. So we built an exceedingly large church. The new tabernacle seated comfortably 5,000 people. It was opened on February 22nd, 1874, for worship, and completed a few months later. End of section 6.